Hi, everybody. Welcome to Road to Lead, the podcast for all things succession planning in the nonprofit and social sectors. We are back today with iCouldBe's Executive Director, Kate Schrauth. Hi, Kate. Good to see you again.
Hello, Michelle. Good to see you.
We're saying good to see you. There is a YouTube and a LinkedIn version of the podcast. Today, we're doing something a little bit different in that Kate and I are just going to have we always have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation about the succession planning process at iCouldBe. We wanted something that was very practical and some very useful takeaways for your own thinking around how to do this with your staff and just kind of what to do next. Kate, talk a little bit about how the succession planning process came to be at iCouldBe from your perspective.
Okay, so soon after you and I took the time we both needed individually and then came together and really started thinking through what would it mean to launch a plan.
Mm-hmm.
I think our first step was to look out into the world and see how others were doing it and what we could learn from them and leverage
Mm-hmm.
for ourselves. Um, we didn't find much,
Mm-hmm.
and what we did find didn't feel completely right for either of us or I could be in general. Putting our heads down and really working together to think through what could that process look like. Certainly having a conversation with the executive committee of the board was a first step that I took, and which was a really wonderful conversation, making sure that they were on board and understood what we were looking to do and how we were looking to do it differently was really important to me personally. But I think it laid the groundwork for you and I to work together and develop a plan that made sense for us. So I think we kind of started from a time frame perspective. If we gave ourselves a long enough runway, you could have the time and understanding obviously that we all had our day jobs to attend to throughout this process. That if we gave a long enough runway that you would have the time to focus on areas that are not currently part of your day-to-day responsibilities but are critical to the organization, as well as kind of focus on the leadership side of things. And that means for me could be different for what that means for you. Just kind of took a slow process to understand what could a year by year plan look like. We had a 5-year runway. We set out kind of what priorities were and what to be thinking about, what my experience in being in a leadership role was, and all of those kinds of things. It really was just a few month process of determining what a 5-year plan could look like and what works for us, identifying those areas we wanted to make sure you had all of the skills and support that you needed, and then organizationally what that could look like.
Yeah, I think from my perspective of going through this, Kate had the separate conversations with the executive committee to ensure that the board was in support of the nomination. So Kate had nominated me to succeed her. After her separate conversations with the board, I was able to have several conversations, first with the executive committee of the board and then other conversations with everybody else, really being able to speak to the vision of what I see for iCouldBe as we transition. To me as the leader, the interest that I had in continuing for us to grow and build upon the work that Kate had been doing for the last 15 years and will be doing for another 5. So it was really about just starting to articulate kind of the goals that I had and helping to see where the board was in terms of how they envision iCouldBe and seeing where there were alignment, any kind of misunderstanding. It was great to go through that in terms of having a board that was as supportive as we have. And I understand that that's not always the case. And so I think having somebody and the role that acts as that first go ahead to the board is super helpful when you're thinking about what does that trajectory look like for you. I think Kate had mentioned the idea of relationships and how important it is. So between you and me at iCouldBe, I think that really set it up for you to be able to advocate to the board, because I don't know that that would have happened had we not had the kind of relationship that would allow you to speak for me.
I agree. And we've worked really hard for a number of years to ensure that not only the executive leadership of iCouldBe has relationships with the board, but that the whole organization does. So that experience laid a really solid foundation for those conversations to happen. And I remember the larger board discussions, so many of them commented on never having been part of a long-term succession planning process, right? I think we've all had experiences with emergency succession planning
Yes.
and doing it in crisis mode.
Mm-hmm.
But doing it in this thoughtful way,
Yes.
and really getting the board to understand the importance of developing leaders within our organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we do with our mentees. We need
Yes.
to walk that talk in our organization. That just really allowed for high levels of trust right from the get-go. Lots of strong relationships already in place, so that whole process just felt thoughtful, meaningful, and supportive for everybody involved. I may have initiated the initial conversation, but
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, your role in having those one-on-one conversations and group
Yeah.
conversations with the board, it was important for me to step back again, right? Get
Mm-hmm.
out of the
Yeah.
way, and let you have that time with them.
I think that is very helpful because the board is going to be so important to the success of the organization, right? To the success of me as the ED of the organization, and really starting to make sure that you can align, even if you don't align with on everything, but at least being able
Mhm.
to have that line of communication open, to talk about what that vision is, to talk about what the plan is, and also to get feedback because they are coming in with different expertise that we may not necessarily have in house or have fully developed. So being able to tap into them as well. So I think, yeah, it was really important to have those separate conversations and then also bring back those into the kind of the larger conversation as it relates to 5 year strategy now. And so much of that that's happening is kind of laying the groundwork for the next 5 years. It's important to have the individual and then tie it back to, how do we lay the groundwork while the succession plan is happening so that we can kind of step up from there. So you're not hitting the ground and trying to figure out, what happens next? But you're having that runaway that Kate said. So it was very challenging to try to find resources that were helpful, that I'll have to give a shout out to Hassan at 4.0 Schools and Joan Gary, who does Nonprofits Are Messy, had some really good resources. But to try to get it to just this space where it's walking through the process with somebody who's going through it as they're going through it and understanding it from their perspective, I could not find. So that's the reason why Road to Lead was created, so that we can be really transparent about what that experience is like, hopefully walk you through the process of actually when I get to become executive director. What I liked about what we did was what we didn't find, we created, and what we found that didn't necessarily fit for us, we personalized and made it work for the organization, made it work for us. And I think that's a good takeaway in terms of how to use the resources that are out there, because not every plan is going to make sense for your particular situation, and you have to adapt it to fit what you need. I think that is something to keep in mind, even here the experience that we're having is not necessarily going to be replicated for you, but what are those key things that you can pull out that will be helpful in your own journey? So, in terms of feelings around transitioning out, and I know, Kate, that we talked a little bit about that in the first episode where we interviewed you on your leadership journey. I'm curious to just see your thoughts around the feelings of transitioning and inviting somebody else into that space. How did that feel like for you?
Overwhelmingly, it's a joyful experience. I mean, at this point, when I started, I could be was on the board for 4 years, and then since 2006 in the executive director role. So we're at 20-ish years at this point of I could be. It's hard to say beyond my immediate family that anything means much more to me than I could be does. I think the process that we've figured out together is what allows this to be a joyful experience, right? So it's that egoless leadership approach where we together are with the whole organization, a strategic roadmap, right? And doing that together, this isn't a win for me if all of our work comes true and everything happens beautifully. It's an organizational win for both of us to have the buy-in that we have for our organizational strategy means that the ego can stay out of the process, right? We're working towards these wonderful, great goals for the organization. So that process keeps it a joyful one and a really exciting one. Certainly, questions come up and how we're going to achieve everything because we have a lot of very large, wonderful goals.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the organizational approach, right? So even as we're looking at you leading the organization, we're also looking at everybody on staff and where are their leadership opportunities. It's comfortable and it's joyful.
I like that you talked about it from the perspective of an organization, because I do think that does help to keep egos out of it. Because if we're looking to create something that will sustain and continue to grow so that it can continue meeting the mission, we're trying to reach more kids. We're trying to equip more kids with the skills and the resources that they need to create the future that they're excited about, right? So if that's our focus, then we can take a step back. How do we get there? And then how we get there is we do it together, right? How do we prepare other staff to be able to continue that legacy? That is an important point in terms of when the succession plan is happening. It's not with just one individual, it's looking at your entire organization and seeing how you're preparing each staff member, where they want to be, how they want to move through the organization, and how you're giving them the ability to do that. And I did want to talk just a little bit on the balance of needing to do the future planning, but also thinking about the realities of the day-to-day work and having to wear many hats, and there are only so many of you. How are we thinking about balancing the need to prepare me for the future and other staff members for the future, but also understanding the reality of the day-to-day responsibilities needing to get done?
So the organizational strategy actually is designed to accommodate for all of that. We all do wear a lot of hats. We're a small staff. We're quite agile. We prototype and pilot on a continual basis. While this transition is happening and everybody has their discrete day-to-day responsibilities, the strategic plan has created space for every staff member to be involved in projects that lead us to that 5-year transition time, with the hope and expectation that that will create an organization that is healthy and happy and filled with burgeoning leaders for success. It's a combination of being careful not to overwhelm everybody on staff with too much, but seeing it in a way where every project is interconnected towards achieving success for an organization that is sustainable. And we are piloting some new things along the way about how we can do that as a staff and board. Again, being really careful not to overwhelm folks, but getting everybody kind of on the same strategic road together and all of the interconnected projects that get us to healthy sustainability.
What the process allowed us to do is to be thoughtful. When we went through our strategic plan, everything in there had to be vetted and really looked at. Are they building upon each other? There's nothing that we have in the strategic plan siloed that's not somehow meeting the needs of something else. It's not moving something else forward. We were able to create the space for me to start taking on more. The financials are one of the things that I needed to get on my plate to be able to spend more time in. I was in independent sector and Gen Fellow in 2021, so I was able to make that time. We were able to make that time because we looked at everything that we had to do and how was it moving the strategy and the mission forward, and really being almost methodical about what stayed on our plate and what had to go. In terms of the work that I was doing, a lot of the day-to-day support of my team, our associate director took that on. And a lot of the management of the schools in her portfolio shrunk. We were very clear on making sure that everybody was well taken care of so they're not overburdened and burned out. And then also looking at what is on our plate and what should be on our plate and what are those things that are moving forward, as opposed to what are the things that we're just doing because we do them. That process really helped us look at the work that we do, and if it's not serving a purpose to move forward, why are we doing it?
Exactly. Exactly. And while there's flexibility built in, everything has to map back. And now we have this process in place to map everything back so that we're not going off in directions that might sound really interesting, but don't ultimately achieve for 2025.
Absolutely. And this roadmap that we're talking about is actually a plan that we wrote out. Where are those strengths? Where are those gaps? What is needed to fill those gaps? Looking at it from the 5-year perspective, what are the goals going to be for that first year, the second year, the third year? Again, still with the flexibility to move things around as needed. For example, the NGen fellowship was something, fellowships weren't something that I had planned on doing until the third year, but the opportunity became available the first year in the succession plan. We had to pivot to make sure that I could make the time to participate. There's flexibility, but there can be flexibility if you don't have direction for where you want to go. Sitting down, creating a plan, going through it together, seeing how it fits into the larger organization, seeing how it fits for your personal, professional development really does begin to help you shape what direction that you want to go and make the decisions that you're going to have to make with your time and your resources personally and as an organization. So, what do you think were some of the challenges, expected or unexpected, over the last 2 years?
One of the pieces that we worked to do early on was create a tactical plan that was timelined out for each year. So, what were the priorities each year? So, you mentioned the fellowship was year 3, ended up being year 1, but generally, right? So, the financials, for example, and learning about nonprofit financials and auditing and all of that. We put that in year 1, right? Let's get that foundational work completed early. Fundraising year 1 and moving all the way through and really thinking about relationships with funders, partners, how to work to build those relationships, and really thinking about development, not just in raising dollars 1 through a million, but what kind of relationships and networks are required to do that. So, right. So that plan was just really thinking through year by year, what do we want to make sure we're doing? And then sharing that plan with the board and them being fully bought in And one of the challenges was, is this a plan or is this a contract? I'm not sure we fully have solved for that, but I think we need to. And I do think by the end of 2022, we need to have that fully thought through, and that there needs to be a contract, right? If Michelle is investing in I could be needs to invest in Michelle. So I would like to see that in more of a legal agreement. So that's kind of been a challenge of navigating that space, and that's again something that there isn't a lot of information out there to lean on and explore. I think that's a topic that, as we move through that process, would be good to revisit here as well.
I'm glad you brought that up. The long runway is amazing because it allows you to plan for so many things. But then are you contracting for 5 years, not knowing how things are going to change, both for the organization and for you personally? What does that agreement look like? It's almost that we have a gentleman's agreement right now that we're taking each other at our word, but there is something to actually putting it on paper and having terms outlined that show respect for the organization and how we're moving, also respect for me and the role that I'm going to be taking, and for the board and how seriously that they take this. So it is a process that we're still figuring out. I think it would be great to talk through in its own episode how we're moving through it.
I agree. And then one other challenge I'll mention is part of a process that you and I talked through is that we would provide regular updates to the board of directors about how we're doing and moving along in that plan. And I think initially it was like any project we work on, right? We report to the board on how we're doing. And then a board member asked me, as she moved into a leadership position on the board, why are we doing that? And I said, well, it's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big project. The board should be informed of our progress along the way. And she said, could you give me one example of a man who would put up with such a thing? And I kind of scratched my head for a minute. And right, so she kind of helped me realize that we we weren't giving an update on a project. We were assessing your skills to take over the leadership. And no one asks me to do that regularly at a board meeting. Why were we making you do that? And it was really eye opening. And I felt awful that I didn't recognize that on my own, because that's what it is, right? That was not the right thing to do. So that was a mistake that I certainly learned from, and would caution others to probably stay away from.
The focus when we were doing this was on the transparency, that it was so important for us to make sure that everybody involved in the organization had ownership and buy-in into how this plan was moving forward. Mm-hmm. So it didn't dawn on me either that it's almost approving of myself over and over again. We're going to make mistakes in this process and we're not going to pick up on it. And thankfully, she did bring it up and put it as she did so that we could see it. And we haven't updated the board in that way at all. And I think that was a good, why are we doing it in this way? And would we have had a man do it in the same? So, yeah, good cautionary tale on our end.
Yep.
In terms of challenges, I'm thinking about what you mentioned just around the contract and the agreement. I've also been trying to balance what my leadership should be in a way that's meaningful for me, in a way that's authentic to me. And I think I have been, and I'll bring the perspective as a Black woman. In the professional space, there is one understanding of what it means to be a leader. And that tends to be white, that tends to be male, and that tends to be affluent. And anything else that diverges from that isn't seen as leadership. So vulnerability is not, it's now, emotional intelligence is now being appreciated as a key leadership skill. But that's not as I was learning what a leader was. You had to exist through this world in a way that wasn't the way that I moved through this world. People first, understanding there is another person and how your actions, your words impact that person was not seen as a leadership skill. It was seen as, oh, that's nice, it's sensitive. It's the woman kind of emotion, right, to leadership, and that wasn't appreciated. So I think I've had to unlearn, or I'm unlearning a lot of what I have been conditioned to believe that a leader is. And because of that, I had shied away from just kind of taking on formalized leadership roles because I did not want to replicate that. So I was like, well, I'm fine in the space that I'm in because that's not how I want to be a leader. So now I'm beginning to understand that you can lead in a way that's authentic to you and meaningful to you and still succeed. That process for me is still ongoing. And hopefully by the time I take on the role, how I lead is going to be meaningful to me and I'm going to be comfortable with doing it in that way. But yeah, there's been the challenge of unlearning what leadership is subscribed as in America.
I couldn't agree more.
For you, what are some things that you've had to unlearn to become a more authentic leader?
So much of what you said really resonates with me, especially in that aspect that you have to be right, you have to be super confident, you have to be like super wealthy, right? It's all these supers. That is not me. I had to unlearn that to say, I like to lead in a very different way. I like very flat organizations. I don't like hierarchy. I'm only successful as the people standing with me. And I know what I don't know. And I am very happy to admit it and bring the expertise and the skill sets to me. That was just not commonplace at any time over the last 30 years, too. Um, it's not what you'd read in Harvard Business School leadership books. Um, so
it's changing now.
it is, and I think a lot of people are understanding the mistakes of that approach, and I'm very happy about that. For me, I just had to be who I am, and I was fortunate enough to have people to learn from and learn with to get there. Sometimes, there have been boards of directors who do not get that or appreciate that. Those were big struggles. That was really challenging and confrontational. But as I've said before, if I don't live my values, I'm not living. Are there things that I could do better? Sure. I'm always looking forward to I could be growing and thriving. That is a never ending quest. But I feel like the type of organization that we've built together means that we're exactly where we need to be.
Could not agree more. What are some unexpected or expected benefits to this succession plan and the way that we've thought about it and how it's been going?
It's forced us, and primarily you, to really get out there and get out in front of the organization. And, when the Engine Fellowship and the networks and the people that we're talking to about this process, about you, about leadership development, the overwhelming feedback is so powerful to me. It's that range from you being celebrated in that fellowship to people's jaws kind of dropping and saying, we aren't thinking about that at all. And whether that's, huge companies or people literally saying to me, we're not doing that well. Not only are we not doing it at all, we're not doing it well. We're not even thinking about it. And that to me just says we must be onto something really powerful here. That's been a joyfully unexpected as well. And I want to kind of keep pushing those boundaries to say, so what does that mean for the nonprofit space, right? How can we be doing this well? And really supporting the people who are already in these organizations doing amazing work. Just a little bit of elevation and really wonderful things happen. Imagine doing that with multiple people over multiple organizations over the entire field. Isn't that what this is all about?
toot our own horn for a little bit. We have existed in a space where things don't have to be as they are. We have never accepted things in terms of the way that we engage with our mentees, in terms of the way that the organization works, in terms of the way that the program, we've never been married to the way things are or the way that they have to be. That approach is clear here. Maybe other organizations, actually the stats support that most nonprofits aren't doing long-term succession planning. They're dealing with emergency succession planning, right? That didn't have to be the case for us because we haven't kind of followed the same blueprint in the organization's history. So why should we follow it here? I think there is kind of an audacity that folks need to just say, okay, that's how it's expected in the sector, but that's not how it has to be. That can come from those who are in the formalized leadership role, but it can also come from somebody who's not in the formal leadership role, because I don't believe that leaders are based on titles. I believe that you're a leader if you're leading. If it's not happening in your organization, propose it. If you are interested in developing into this role, have that conversation, see who you can tap into. As Kate was saying in her first interview, identify people that you can start building those relationships with and start building those relationships, invite them out, have a conversation. Taking on that initiative and just not accepting things as they are is something that is in the DNA of our organization, and definitely something that I want to continue.
If we've learned anything over the last 2 years, it's to challenge the status quo. It's important.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean we throw away best practices. It doesn't
Nope,
mean we throw away legacy and
absolutely not. Yeah.
right, but challenge it. Confront why things are working the way they are. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe 25% is working great and 75% really needs thoughtful conversation and
Mm-hmm.
process change. That's where all of this opportunity lies, I think, is asking why and
Mm-hmm.
how could it be different.
You're absolutely right. So a couple of years ago, I wrote an article around nonprofits as a sector just being white, because I remember April had the hashtag Oscar so white. And I
Mhm.
remember the first time that I heard it, I literally laughed out loud and I went, if you think Oscar's white, you should see nonprofits. And I remember just being like, I have been in spaces, in leadership spaces, where I'm looking around and I am the only non-white face. And most of those organizations serve students of color. You get kind of busy with your day to day and just kind of going along. So you don't really have a lot of time to be thinking about it in the space that you're working. But those conversations happen off work, right? They're happening with your peers. They're happening with your support system. The ED role wasn't something that I was going after, and it wasn't one way or the other that I thought that I deserved it or didn't deserve it. I just wasn't thinking about it. But I was thinking, what happens with all of the leaders of color that are behind me who may be actively wanting to lead an organization but are not being supported in a way that would allow them to move forward. But these are also the same organizations that are externally putting a stake in the ground on how diverse and how equitable they are. So that disconnect was always an issue for me. It's something that needs to be confronted as a sector. How are we being intentional about making sure that we are living the DEI statements that we're making? When your program team is fully non-white faces, but your leadership is all white faces with maybe one other thrown in there, there is a disconnect between the mission that you're saying that you're supporting versus the mission that you're actually living. It is just something when we're thinking about the status quo that doesn't have to be, that we need to, as a sector, deal with.
Absolutely. And Michelle, your leadership on that subject and writing that article was really meaningful to me. And when you have those conversations, you can't not do anything. The conversation has to require action. You published that article in November, and it was that following January when I was at the National Mentoring Summit. That's exactly what I saw across the entire mentoring field and said,
Yeah.
if it's not up to me, who is it up to?
There is the not passing the buck. I can't do anything about it. Yeah.
As I was talking to people in the field about it, I remember one person commenting, "Kate, you're so fierce, and and you're just like get right at that." And I wasn't sure about that word because I don't think of myself as being fierce, but that's okay. But they also said something like, "You're one of the few people I could see who would sacrifice themselves," and you know, to it right to walk the talk kind of thing. And I remember being so taken aback.
Mhm.
This is not a self-sacrifice. There are many opportunities for me to do the work that I want to do. This is about doing the right thing for the organization. I've been here a long time. It's important that leaders change. New vision is important. And you can't just keep having these conversations and not do anything. This whole holistic piece that is really important to me. And it just kind of reminded me again. So, is that the conversation we're now going to have? This isn't about sacrifice or sacrificing yourself, not even close to that.
I remember hearing that, and it was both surprising and not at all surprising because perception of having diverse anything or having things be equitable, there is this unspoken that it is a sacrifice in order to put somebody in who is not to the quality of what you need, but we're doing it because we have to. From a perspective of a Black person, it's not surprising to hear because we assume that when people talk about diversity based on experience, this is what we know that diversity is, that we're making a sacrifice so that we can give the Black people a chance or the brown people a chance, but not necessarily because they're qualified to lead in a way that a white person can. So that that wasn't a surprise at all, but it was also a surprise because those are the things that set up leaders for failure. The challenge for me at the very beginning, once I decided, okay, this was something that I did want to do, was that by the time I take over, this will have been a 25-year sustaining organization, growing organization, and I will be the first person of color to lead it. And if it tanks on my watch, then that is proving what I know is in the back of other people's minds. I'm having to unlearn that other people's perception has nothing to do with my ability to lead this organization. And you're going to think what you're going to think, but at the end of the day, I know what the reality is. It is a hard conversation to have, but that perception is there. That expectation of failure does undermine leaders of color because then you're setting them up to fail.
Exactly. And so our process has to be arm in arm, good strategy, strong leader development, joyful work all along the way to make sure that you can and will be successful.
Absolutely. We could continue this conversation for a very long time, and we are planning on continuing to have these check ins about what the process has been like. But that will be all for today. Kate, thank you so much for joining, and thank you for being candid and open. Looking forward to continuing those conversations.
Excellent. Thanks, Michelle.
No problem. Bye.